Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast on another glorious triumph of European Union diplomacy, namely the creation of a special tribunal to judge the crime of aggression on the part of Russia. Now, when you create courts, you have to be sure of a couple of things. Now, first of all, you have to make sure that any court you create does have jurisdiction over the matters that you claim that it has jurisdiction over. And secondly, you have to be sure that the court can be trusted to administer impartial justice. Now, what the EU has created, of course, has failed on both counts. And one has to say that that's very much true of all of these various ad hoc tribunals that the Western powers are very keen on creating. The International Criminal Court, and it is an ad hoc court because it has no basis in law. It has no authorization from the United Nations. The International Criminal Court is based on the Rome Statute, and its jurisdiction comes about through it's the signatories to the Rome Treaty accepting the jurisdiction of the ICC. But those states that don't sign on to the Rome Statute, that don't accept the jurisdiction of the ICC, well, there's very limited amount that the ICC can do about them. Now, it is true that those who are signatories of the Rome Statute can file complaints with the ICC, claiming that they have been the victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide by a power that is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, and then the ICC can indeed investigate. So that's what happened in the case of Israel and Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority signed on to the Rome Statute. Israel, of course, is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, but so the Palestinian Authority filed a complaint with the ICC, and then the ICC issued its arrest warrants against Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. And something similar happened in the case of Ukraine and Russia. Now, neither Russia nor Ukraine is a signatory of the Rome Statute. Russia did originally sign on to the Rome Statute, as the United States did, but neither Russia nor the United States ever ratified the Rome Statute. The United States left the Rome Statute. I mean, it withdrew its signature in 2002 under George W. Bush. But Russia continued as a signatory of the Rome Statute, even though it never ratified it, all the way up to 2016, at the moment when the ICC announced that basically Russia more than likely committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. And what happened was that Ukraine also was not a signatory of the Rome Statute, but it declared that it accepted ICC jurisdiction for any war crimes taking place on the territory of Ukraine after 2015. So that enabled Ukraine to file a complaint with the ICC against Russia, and then the ICC said, "Yeah, well, I think Russia committed crimes on the territory of Ukraine. And at that point, Russia then withdrew its signature from the Rome Statute. Now, there was always a problem with the Rome Statute because the drafters were very keen on keeping the United States in. And for a while the negotiations were taking place over the Rome Statute, it seemed as if the United States would be a part of the ICC. And as I said, it was a signatory of the Rome Statute. Bill Clinton signed on to the Rome Statute, even though he never presented it for ratification with the Senate. And of course, it would never have been ratified. But the only way that they could keep the Americans on board was if they took out of ICC jurisdiction the so-called crime of aggression, crimes against peace. If you remember, at Nuremberg, that was the crime of all crimes, the fundamental crime of the Nazis and all the other crimes, the crimes against humanity, crimes against the rules of war. All of those crimes were said by the Nuremberg prosecutors. They were said to have flowed directly from the original crime, the crime of all crimes, which was the crime against peace. But nonetheless, the drafters of the Rome Statute realized that there was no way that they could keep the Americans on board if they kept that as a crime falling within the jurisdiction of the ICC. So they absolutely said, no, we're not going to have the crime of aggression within the Rome Statute. Where, we'll have crimes against humanity, crimes against the rules of war, and genocide, but not the crime of aggression. And that kept the Americans on board. And so it went on for years and years, even after the Americans had left. The crime of aggression, the crimes against peace, was still not within the jurisdiction of the ICC. But that gradually, the pressure grew that we got to do something about the crime of aggression. And eventually, the crime of aggression was added to the Rome Statute. It came about through a conference in Kampala, Uganda, and they're known as the Kampala Amendments to the Rome Statute. And so with the Kampala Amendments, now the crime of aggression falls within the jurisdiction of the ICC. But there are caveats. First of all, the ICC can only adjudge the crime of aggression against signatories of the Rome Statute, and specifically those signatories to the Rome Statute that had ratified the Kampala Amendments. So even though you may be a signatory of the Rome Statute and have ratified the Rome Statute, if you haven't specifically ratified the Kampala Amendments, then the ICC cannot investigate any charge of crime of aggression. So even the case of Ukraine and Russia, where, as I said, Ukraine claimed that it accepts the jurisdiction of the ICC, even though it's not a signatory of the Rome Statute. It accepts the jurisdiction of the ICC for any crimes taking place on the territory of Ukraine after 2015. Even so, Ukraine cannot bring a claim of aggression against Russia. Russia obviously is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, but very narrowly, if you haven't ratified the Kampala Amendments, then you are not you cannot be investigated or charged and indicted for the crime of aggression by the ICC. One has to keep in mind that, a number of states, some 40, 45, 46 signatories of the Rome Statute did ratify the Kampala amendments. And, as you would expect, many of the EU and NATO countries did so, but by no means all. For instance, the United Kingdom never ratified the Kampala amendments. Neither did France, neither did Greece, neither did Hungary. So it's very much a somewhat esoteric, amendments. This the issue of crime of aggression. So in any case, there was just no way, while the ICC can investigate theoretically the accusation that Russia committed genocide or crimes against humanity in Ukraine, it cannot investigate the crime of aggression on the part of Russia. So what does the EU do? The EU then says, okay, well, we're going to set up our own tribunal specifically to investigate the crime of aggression perpetrated by Russia. Now, right away, there's a problem here because, again, now you have the ICC, which basically already, as I said, like it can't address the aggression accusation, and so the EU, which is going to set up this court, really isn't in any position to set up any kind of an impartial tribunal for the very obvious reason that the EU is an interested party, and therefore any rulings that it will issue will have no validity because it's an interested party ruling against another interested party, namely Russia. And indeed, the very principle that they've just enunciated, we're going to set up a tribunal to adjudge Russia, indicates that the final judgment has already been determined. They've already decided ahead of time that Russia is guilty of the crime of aggression. They said, in setting up this tribunal, they've already determined the final verdict of this of their own tribunal. So it's kind of a somewhat problematic. So let's just take a look first at this story about the special tribunal, and here we have the Commission and High Representative Kaja Kallas welcome a major step towards holding Russia accountable for its war of aggression against Ukraine. Today, senior legal experts at the European Commission, the European External Action Service, the Council of Europe, Ukraine. So Ukraine, an interested party, is also in the business of setting up this tribunal. And 37 states laid down the legal foundations for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The participants also set out the key elements of the Schuman draft statute. So Schuman, they always want to dress themselves up with some fancy figure from the past, to give a patina of gravitas and responsibility. So they bring up Robert Schuman, who was one of the architects of the European Economic Community, as it then was. So they call this statute the Schuman draft statute. As if somehow Robert Schuman naturally would not only have approved of it, but would in fact have himself drafted some statute along these lines. So the core legal text that will govern the functioning of the special tribunal. And then Ursula von der Leyen said, when Russia chose to roll its tanks over Ukraine's borders, breaking the UN Charter, it committed one of the gravest violations. the crime of aggression. Now justice is coming, justice for Ukraine. We have laid down the legal foundations for a special tribunal. Notice what she's done here. She's already predetermined the outcome. She's prejudged anything that this tribunal will do. And she says, oh, well, this is illegal. How can you set up a legal foundation for anything when you already know the outcome? You've already determined that there was a crime of aggression and Russia is responsible, and that this tribunal is going to find Russia guilty of this crime that you have stipulated. There can be no justice without compensation. Russia must be held accountable for its aggression, and it must pay. So again, where's the legal foundation? Is this part of the Robert Schuman legal principles? We made a first step towards a claims commission with the participation of the EU. This new body will determine claims recorded in the register of damage. But again, the EU already has its hands on the frozen assets, the sovereign assets of Russia. It's not going to return this money, and we already know that it's going to disburse funds from this assets that it has illegally seized. Again, this is completely illegal what it did. In furtherance of a judgment that it's already made. This will be the legal basis, the quote legal unquote basis for handing over money that belongs to Russia that was stolen by the EU, handing this over to Ukraine. And then once operational, the tribunal will have the power to hold Russia, to hold to account Russian political and military leaders who bear the greatest responsibility for the crime of aggression. Again, you've already determined the outcome. I mean, what kind of a legal procedure is it when you've determined the outcome before any proceeding has taken place? Today's meeting is a breakthrough in a continuing process towards ensuring accountability for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, as well as for upholding the international criminal justice system. You are not upholding anything. This is a total violation of any notion of a criminal justice system. I mean, if you already determine who's guilty and who's going to be made to pay, then there's no justice here. And as I said, they couldn't do it through the ICC. So this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to find a way around the problem that even the ICC, which, as I said, is an ad hoc tribunal, it's not a serious court. It has no legal authority. But even that said that we can only deal with the issue of the crime of aggression if a state has ratified the Kampala amendments, or if the United Nations Security Council has referred the matter to us. So if the UN Security Council said, well, I think a crime of aggression has taken place here, please investigate and set up the appropriate criminal trial, then then the ICC could move on the crime of aggression. But it can't happen in this case, obviously, because Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and of course it would not permit any such intervention on the part of the Security Council. So it says, today the European Commission also adopted a recommendation to the Council to participate in the formal negotiations to set up an international claims commission for Ukraine. So this is still going on about how we can steal Russia money. The Claims Commission will be the body responsible to review, assess, and decide eligible claims recorded in the Register of Damage and determine the amount of compensation due in each case. Again, this is being done by people who are interested parties. NATO is an interested party. The states who are setting up this tribunal are all interested parties. They're all in the business of funding and arming Ukraine in its war against Russia. So they're interested party, therefore they're not in any position to hold any legal proceeding, and certainly not in a position to decide how much money is to be paid in compensation. And then we have the next step. The special tribunal will be established by an agreement between the government of Ukraine and the Council of Europe. It will derive its jurisdiction from Ukraine. The Council of Europe will be in charge of the procedure for adoption of the draft legal instruments necessary for the establishment of the special tribunal and subsequent signature. Again, what legal instruments? There are no legal. This has nothing to do with any legality. For the Claims Commission, the first round of negotiations for the international instrument will start towards the end of March 2025. Once the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine is established, Ukrainian national authorities will be able to refer ongoing domestic investigations and prosecutions related to the crime of aggression to the prosecutor of the special tribunal. So again, they're collaborating with Ukraine, which is obviously an interested party, and Ukraine, which has been involved in a long-standing dispute confrontation with Russia, is clearly presenting a case against an adversary. There's nothing here about any legality, because it's presenting a case to its friends, allies, and enablers, as well as to transmit relevant information and evidence gathered in the context of the work carried out within the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression. The establishment of the tribunal within the Council of Europe's institutional framework, as well as the presence of international judges and relevant applicable international law, will ensure that criminal proceedings are conducted in respect of the highest procedural safeguards and applicable international human rights law. Let's read that again and then just try to read it with a straight face. I mean, the interested parties are putting on trial their adversaries. They can't even do it through a halfway respectable ad hoc tribunal like the International Criminal Court. So they had to invent their own court. And then they have the insolence to say, we will be observing the highest procedural safeguards. Can you imagine that? The highest procedural safeguards. They will absolutely provide Russia with the fairest possible hearing, provide, make sure that Russia, case is heard, and objective, impartial judges, after long and arduous deliberation, will render their verdict. The presence of international judges and a relevant applicable international law. There is no applicable international law. The crime of aggression was kept out of the Rome Statute, then introduced, but only in very, very limited circumstances through the Kampala amendments. And those limited circumstances do not apply to the war in Ukraine. So how can you even talk about the highest procedural safeguards? And what procedural safeguard? You already determined the outcome and applicable international human rights law. There's no applicable international human rights law. You've made this up. And then we have Ursula von der Leyen. Again, this is we've already had this, and then Kaja Kallas. This absurd person, this former Estonian prime minister, who is now the foreign minister of the EU, a completely unaccountable person, but who apparently is running the EU foreign policy, said, today we have taken an important step. It's always an important step. Every time you set up these bogus tribunals, these bogus courts, It's always an important step. And on hand, inevitably, is the Human Rights Brigade to lend the pattern of respectability and say, yes, this is it. There, finally, accountability is coming. Finally, political leaders no longer have impunity. They're always there. However bogus these legal instruments are, there's always the Human Rights Brigade to tell us how frightfully important it all is. Today, we have taken an important step towards establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. There is a broad international support for this. Again, what international support? Crime of aggression, you've already prejudged the outcome. Unpunished crimes only encourage new atrocities. This is always the song and dance. They always are unpunished. It has to be because this will act as a deterrent for future crimes. Of course, it never does, because states go to war when their vital interests are at stake. And they are not deterred by the possibility that Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen will someday set up some phony baloney court to decide how much money they're going to help themselves to. This is a signal to the world that no one from Russian leadership is untouchable. How are they going to touch Russia's leadership? Russia will not take part in any of this, obviously, and this tribunal has no jurisdiction, none. It has no mechanism even for enforcing any of its judgments. So therefore, this is just entirely make-believe. So what's the plan? I mean, is that they're planning to send their tanks into Moscow to seize Russia's leaders? Who's going to send these tanks? Maybe Kaja Kallas's former country of Estonia, which owns 0 tanks. And then here we have this story. On the 4th of February, senior legal experts of the European Commission, blah blah, the legal foundations for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. The participants also set out key elements of the Truman draft statute, and then it goes on. The meeting was a breakthrough. It's always a breakthrough. This is everything is that's the classic banality from the Human Rights Brigade. This is a breakthrough. This is unprecedented. Of course, it's not unprecedented. They've done this many times before, and everything just depends on whether you are able to enforce your bogus judgments. The ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which obviously also had no legal foundations, no legal basis for rendering its decisions. However, it could enforce its judgments because NATO was on hand to enforce its judgments, and the leaders in Yugoslavia were only too eager to cooperate with a NATO court. But in this case, they don't have no means of enforcing their judgments because Russia obviously will have no hand in this enforcement. So we'll break through in the process of ensuring accountability for the crime of aggression, and then upholding the international criminal justice system. This total violation of international criminal justice, but they're going to be upholding it. There has to be a clear division between war crimes and the crimes of aggression, says Kaja Kallas. War crimes can be prosecuted by the ICC, but the crime of aggression can only be prosecuted by a special tribunal. A special tribunal set up by interested parties. NATO and the EU and Kaja Kallas and particularly her country of Estonia and the Baltic Chihuahuas They are all interested parties. They are absolutely up to their necks in this war in Ukraine. So their special tribunal has nothing whatsoever to do with justice. It's clear that the crime of aggression is a leadership crime. Therefore, it is extremely important that there is also accountability for the crime of aggression. No one from Russian leadership is untouchable. That's the message that this tribunal sends. What are you going to do? Again, you're going to send in your armored brigades and to seize Russia's leaders. So again, when say it's untouchable, this special tribunal isn't adding anything. I mean, already within NATO land and in the EU, who are all signatories of the Rome Statute, they would eagerly, more than eagerly, arrest Russia's leaders, and in particular President Putin, who has already been indicted by the ICC. But Russia's leaders are not going to travel to NATO land. So therefore, again, this doesn't add anything to the situation that prevailed, because the ICC has already issued arrest warrants against Putin. That already was a long time ago, on the issue of child abduction. And then there can also be no justice without compensation. Russia must be held accountable for its aggression, and it must pay. We made a first step towards a claims commission and the participation of the EU. This new body will determine claims recorded in the register of damage. Again, interested parties deciding how much of Russia's money that they intend to loot. And then the Guardian, of course, beyond ecstatic about accountability, the end of impunity, historic breakthrough. It's always the same platitudes. Foundations laid for tribunal to try Putin for Ukraine invasion. And then here we have international lawyers, which have always sounds fantastic. You always ask, who are these international lawyers? They're interested parties. They're not, but it suggests that these are legal scholars who have given the matter of war crimes trial some very serious thought. International lawyers have laid the foundation for a special tribunal to try Russia for the crime of aggression. The EU has said, hailing a significant step, yes, significant step, always get the language, significant step, towards holding Vladimir Putin and his top officials accountable for the invasion of Ukraine. So again, they're going to hold accountable states that are, thoroughly involved in the war in Ukraine. They're going to hold. You can't hold them accountable. If you're going to have any kind of a judicial proceeding, then it must be held under the auspices of disinterested, neutral legal authorities. In other words, that they can be trusted to dispense justice in a fair-minded, impartial way. But when you say, yeah, we'll give you a fair trial before we find you guilty and seize your money, that really isn't the basis for impartial justice. In a statement late on Tuesday, the EU executive declared a breakthrough that it said would mean the Russian and political military leaders who bear the greatest responsibility would be held to account. Held to account by whom? By Kaja Kallas? I mean, it's Ursula von der Leyen. And then Kaja Kallas, there's no doubt that Putin has committed the crime of aggression, which is deciding to attack another country. So again, she's already declared this as she's setting up this tribunal. There's no doubt, she has already no doubt, he has committed the crime of aggression. And without that crime, there wouldn't be any killing on the ground. There wouldn't be attacks on civilian infrastructure, civilians, rapes. Setting up a tribunal, she said, was also about putting pressure on Putin and the regime to really stop this war, and also to give a clear signal to other aggressors or would-be aggressors who are or maybe contemplating attacking neighboring countries. Now, the whole idea that anyone's going to stop a war because there's some tribunal and some little pipsqueak like Kaya Kallas is threatening legal proceedings is ridiculous. I mean, states go to war when fundamental interests are at stake, and they pursue them, to achieve whatever ends they want to achieve. The least of their concerns is any tribunal. And the same way was, we would be aggressors. No, there's no such thing as an aggression. When states deem their interests are threatened, when vital issues of national survival, national sovereignty at stake, they go ahead and do whatever they need to do. You can call them aggression, you can call them anything you like, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just that your view, Kaya Kallas' view, that this is aggression. Other states don't do that. Don't think of it as aggression. They say this was a preemptive war because our fundamental interests were under threat. And the least consideration they're going to make, the least, is concern about some Mickey Mouse international court that will one day hold them to account. I mean, it's not going to happen. So that the idea that it acts as any kind of deterrence, it never acts as any kind of a deterrence. Talks which began last June between the EU, Ukraine, pan-European human rights body, the Council of Europe, and 37 other countries had been held up over whether Putin and other Russian leaders should be granted immunity. As a compromise, it is understood that Putin and senior figures would not be prosecuted while in office. Well, they're not going to be prosecuted. How would they prosecute Putin? What like what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And then the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Putin and other senior Russian officials over the abduction of Ukraine children, but it does not have the power to try crimes of aggression, as Russia has not ratified the ICC treaty. That's incorrect. That's a complete confusion. It can put the fact that Russia hasn't ratified the ICC treaty, that's not the issue as to whether it can put it can try Russia. As I said, Ukraine brought charges against Russia to the ICC, and because Ukraine accepts ICC jurisdiction, then the ICC can investigate Russia. Russia, of course, doesn't care what the ICC does or doesn't do. But the issue of the crimes of aggression has nothing to do with it. The crimes of aggression is a very specific, and the ICC has no jurisdiction over that. Even if you are a member of the ICC, if you have ratified the Rome Statute, you still can't be put on trial for the crime of aggression if you haven't ratified the Kampala amendments. Another mooted opinion option is the amendment of the ICC Rome Statute in the UN General Assembly, but many experts argue that would be unworkable, as many members of the court have not submitted to its jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. Yeah, it can't happen. To break the logjam, there's no logjam here, there's just flat out illegality. To break the logjam, the COV, the Council of Europe, which has 46 member states, and expel Russia of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has offered to host the tribunal. Its own tribunal. That's awfully generous of you, old man. You're going to host the tribunal. And then here we have EU hails major progress, major of course, to set up special tribunal to judge Vladimir Putin. Again, this is, what a fantastic court. They're already going to judge Putin. And then the coalition of 38 countries, including all members of the European Union, announced on Tuesday major progress in their joint work to establish a special tribunal to judge the Russian leadership for the crime of aggression committed against Ukraine. The work among experts and lawyers has so far centered on drafting the legal statute that will underpin the tribunal and determine its jurisdiction. The statute is not yet final, but the coalition hopes that it will be endorsed before the end of the year. Details of the text have not been made public. It doesn't matter one bit, because whatever the text is, this tribunal has no jurisdiction over Russia, and there's no jurisdiction to try the crime of aggression. And then the tribunal will prosecute Russia's political and military leaders, including President Putin, and be established within the framework of the Council of Europe. Human Rights Organization Secretary General Alain Bezant said the institution would be ready to act once the mandate is green-lighted at the political level. Oh, well, that's so fantastic. To wait is not an option. We must really act as fast as possible, and we will do so the best way to finish the work, and we will do the best way to try to finish the work this year. To wait is not an option. There's always this, when it comes to this human rights brigade, there's always this melodrama. To wait is not an option. It's not, we have to do it now. Why do you have to do it now? You know, there's never any rush. If there's justice, then justice has to be a very deliberative process. You have to make sure that that you've put all the you have all the ducks in a row. You've collected all your evidence. You had all your witness testimony, and above all, you will have to have conducted a fair, thorough, impartial investigation, and that usually takes time. And you have to make sure, above all, that your victim of your tribunal has the means to defend himself. Now, the idea that to wait is not an option, as if you have to rush when you're going to rush this thing through, is obviously a complete anathema to impartial justice. But this is always the talk of these crowds who are always setting up these tribunals. We can't wait. We have to do it now, even though that's obviously not in keeping with the basis of impartial justice. We must be very ambitious, of course, very ambitious. And I think if there's a will, there's also the possibility to work to achieve this. So ambitious means you just make things up as you go along. That's always been the case. You just create your own jurisprudence, as the ICTY did. You just create your, your own concepts of culpability, your own legal concepts. They just invented it out of whole cloth. But it's part of their being ambitious. And then, unlike war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, which are applied to the individuals who commit the atrocities, such as military officers and mercenaries, the crime of aggression is a leadership crime that targets the person ultimately in charge of controlling the aggressor state. This, of course, is complete and utter balderdash. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide those charges were brought against leaders. At the ICTY, they were brought against leaders. No less than seven Serbian presidents, Serbian heads of state, and I mean presidents of Serbia, presidents of Yugoslavia, presidents of the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, presidents of the Krajina Srpska in Croatia, were charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. Many of them were found guilty of genocide by the ICTY. So this is total nonsense. That somehow, we can't have this in political leaders. No, these were absolutely, they found them guilty, again, not because they committed those crimes, but because those are the terms of reference of the ICTY, a court that, though it had the imprimatur of a UN Security Council resolution, was essentially run by NATO. But this thing, oh, it's a leadership crime. Well, you already got the leaders, and that was always the purpose of the ICTY and of the ICC. You go after the leaders. You don't go after individual officers. They were never interested in that. The whole point of the ICTY, the whole point of the ICC is to go after the leaders. This thing about the aggression, that's just the cherry on the cake. There was never any shortage of means of going after the leaders. As I say, seven Serb presidents were charged and found guilty by the ICTY. All seven of them are in prison. They're all in prison, other than the ones who died in prison, but the rest are still in prison. The aggression can consist of an invasion, an occupation, blockade of ports or any other sort, the use of weapons by a state against another. According to the ICC, the crime of aggression relates to the planning and blah, blah, blah. And then this makes Putin the likeliest defendant in a future trial. What trial? There's not going to be a trial. And again, this is where this whole thing it becomes so ridiculous. You cannot have a trial of anyone if a person is not there. And because if you hold a trial in absentia, in other words, if the defendant is not there to present a defense, then you're in violation of innumerable international covenants and international human rights statutes, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Civil and Political Rights. I mean, you can just rattle them all off. But they all agree on one thing, that you cannot have a trial of anyone unless he is there in person to present a defense. So you can't have a defense of Putin, of a trial of Putin or a defendant, because he's not going to be there. So again, they just make this stuff up to make it sound as if we're talking about real, legal proceedings, trials, prosecutors, defense, judges, all wearing their fancy robes. That possibility, however, remains an abstract aspiration at best. Heads of state enjoy immunity from prosecution under international law, and the trial in absentia risks being seen as illegitimate. That's untrue. Absolutely untrue. The ICC makes clear that heads of state do not enjoy immunity. It's in the Rome Statute. These people write these stories. They brief on these stories. And they're absolutely ignorant. It's in the Rome Statute that heads of state don't enjoy immunity, whether they're acting heads of state or former heads of state. They don't enjoy immunity. What the hell do you think happened to Muammar Gaddafi when he was indicted by the ICC right in the middle of NATO's bombing campaign against Libya? ICC was on hand to provide legitimacy to what NATO was doing by indicting Muammar Gaddafi. What immunity? That's why when the ICC issued its arrest warrant against Putin, who is head of state, the ICC said, well, every state now has an obligation to arrest Putin. I mean, the people who write this stuff are just total morons. They just sit there, some legal expert briefs them, talks nonsense to them, and they just write it down without any questioning. I think that's about it. Now, although the ICC established jurisdiction over crimes of aggression under the so-called Kampala amendments, this only applies to countries and nationals from countries that are party to the Rome Statute. No, wrong. The Kampala Amendment only applies to countries that specifically ratified the Kampala Amendment. So it applies to countries and nationals and countries that are party to the Rome Statute. No, even if you're a party to the Rome Statute, if you haven't ratified the Kampala amendments, it doesn't apply to you. You know, this is exhausting. That is why Kiev and Brussels have explored the option of creating an ad hoc tribunal that would be empowered to prosecute the specific case of Russia's war in Ukraine. Oh, thank God, you know, justice is in good hands. Anyway, this this nonsense kind of gets me a little bit excited and upset. It's just so much nonsense is talked here. But the important point is that the NATO powers are constantly looking for some basis to legitimize their ongoing fueling, funding, exacerbating of a war on their own continent, on the European continent. And they need some legal basis for doing so. So this is on hand, you know, and the media can say, oh, the special tribunal. And then, of course, we had the ICC arrest warrant, was also a shot in the arm for NATO. And of course, as I said, the ICC served that purpose in the middle of the bombing campaign against Libya. Oh, look, we've issued our indictment of Gaddafi, not an indictment of NATO, of course, but an indictment of Gaddafi. And of course, back in the 90s, the ICTY was continually issuing indictments against Serb leaders in order to provide some legal support for the activities of NATO. So, you know, this is all part of a pattern. It's very important that none of these things, neither the ICC nor the special tribunal, none of them is ever given any legal basis, any argument in support, any justification. Because I know people do this, they say, oh yeah, but I like what the ICC is doing with Israel. Look, you know, they've issued an arrest warrant against Bibi Netanyahu, so the ICC can't be so bad. No, it is every bit as bad as it is. And if you go down this path of trying to justify the ICC because it's going after someone you don't like, then you're undercutting yourself. You're sawing off the branch of the tree that you're sitting on, because the ICC is going to come after you, and you won't have any basis to object to it because you've already declared that it's doing good work when it's indicting the people that you don't like. But it said, hey, well, you know, it's a court. You know, we indict Bibi, and now we're indicting you, and I think that a number of countries, including Russia, have found out that you can't play this game. You know, well, like you support the ICC when it's doing that, but then you find, well, I didn't think the ICC would come after me, but yet, as I said, Russia was still a signatory of the Rome Statute, even in 2011 when it indicted Muammar Gaddafi at the height of NATO's bombing campaign. But anyway, I've gone on for far too long. Thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.